This is an opportunity for, if there's any questions in the audience, questions online as well, to send them through. And we really want to hear, your what you want to draw out a bit further from the speakers. But maybe I might just start with a question. Hugh, you really brought us back to our human nature and trying to make that more explicit. And then, throughout the presentations, and sorry, I might just say Alip had to leave for another meeting, so he's not joining us online. So the other speakers also spoke to our reality, which is really inconsistent these days with, in our day and age, with what our true human nature is, this high nature of one that is capable of being kind, working collectively. And when we think about the institutions in our society, from, government to, any type of organisation through to the media, which really can set the direction of how we think about each other in society, how do we here create that consistency? What is it that we can do? And Tessa was saying it's a commitment to, a long-term process. If all of you have any thoughts on, some simple steps that can be taken now to think about shifting our inner reality of who we are to be projected in the structures of our society, because sometimes that just feels almost impossible and a hard task.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Thanks, I think. That's a great. It's interesting that leadership got mentioned a couple of times this morning, and I didn't mention it. I acknowledge that leadership plays a vital role in setting the tone of a culture in an organisation, a family, in a school, in a nation. But I think we've seen how destructive that can be, not just in obvious ways when you have a mad leader, but also in allowing individuals to feel that they can abdicate their own responsibility. The government will fix it. But part of the disease of contemporary Australia is the feeling that something needs to be done, the government will fix it. So I'm not discounting for a moment the crucial role of leadership, but I am urging us to say, it's a bit of an echo of what Tessa was saying, I am urging us to embrace the idea that it actually is up to us. That we have to start thinking within our households, within our street, in the local neighbourhood, in the workplace, that how we act individually does influence other people. Tessa also reminded us that fine words can be pretty vacuous. It's all about action. It is all about action. It's all about how we treat other people. The influence of that example, of showing kindness to everyone, of terminating a relationship kindly, of disciplining someone kindly, or having an argument kindly. It can be done. We know it can be done. It's up to individuals to drop that stone into the pond and let the ripples go out. I'm in despair when I hear people saying the government has to do something about this. The government isn't going to do anything about social cohesion. The government may attend to some social disorders and diseases and disruptions like homelessness and poverty and so on, but they're not very aggressive about addressing either of those, for a start, to say nothing of refugees, asylum seekers, etc. Let's not rely on the fine words, the rhetoric. Let's acknowledge that if we are the dreamers, then we have to be the actors. And it starts now. And it starts with saying there's a woman at the end of my street who lives alone and I've never spoken to her. I better go there tomorrow, knock on her door and say, hello, I'm here, I live over the road. I don't want to interfere, but if you ever need anything, here's my number. And by the way, here's a bag of lemons from that tree. It's just simple stuff that just establishes the connections and that great. The most chilling thing to me of social research findings over the last 3 years has been that figure coming out of the Australian Psychological Society and Swinburne Uni study showing 25% of Australian adults feel lonely most of the time. What have we done? You know, that means when you're on a bus or when you're walking along the street or when you're walking down your own street, probably every fourth person you see is aching. They're lonely. And all you have to do is smile and say good day. So I'm advocating really simple, personal, local, immediate initiatives to build cohesion where you are, knowing that if enough of us are doing it, it will, well, Tessa says the work of generations, of course it is, but we're at a very particularly exciting moment because there's been so much drama. And was it Tessa who also said that change comes out of terrible suffering? We grow through pain, all those things that our folklore tells us, which are true. It's pathetic, but true, that we need shocks to destabilise us and remind us of what it means to be human.
Just wondering if any of our other speakers would like to speak to that.
Thank you for the question. I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that Hugh has mentioned. And I'm overly cynical. I'm not as sort of generous as Hugh is in terms of one often hears the phrase and love thy neighbour. I have great difficulty with that. I don't love my neighbour. I don't even like my neighbour. And I don't think I should have to like my neighbour, let alone love him or her. But I do believe I need to respect my neighbour. And to me, respect is, so I'm not as generous as you about being kind to everybody. I don't think I'm a particularly kind person, but I think one needs to respect one another. And there was a great line I once saw in a book, it was called The Fixer, where the person in that book says that respect is something you must have in order to get. I thought that was a brilliant use of English. Respect is something you must have in order to get. And I believe that if you respect your neighbour, and therefore one can expect respect in return, I think that's a pretty solid basis for a civil society. Now, it doesn't go to the kindness which you would like to see us all, and I totally get that. And in fact, it reminds me, I've been listening to a podcast by an American, his name is Jay Ruderman, and he interviews random people who've had confronting experiences. And one I listened to recently, he interviewed a young man who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge to commit suicide, obviously. And a tiny, tiny percentage of people who jump off that bridge ever survive for all sorts of reasons. Because it's... And obviously he survived because he's now being interviewed. And what this young man said, and he was all of 22 when he jumped off the bridge, I think something like 22, was when he got off the bus and he was walking up and down the Golden Gate Bridge before he jumped and wrestling with himself. And he said that all he was desperately hoping for was that someone would smile at him. And if someone had, he says, he wouldn't have jumped, and no one did. Now, and he jumped, and thank God he survived, and all sorts of circumstances came into play. But to your point, and you made that point so well, Hugh, that's what he was desperately hoping for. So, I mean, I guess that would have been an act of kindness. And to go back to where Hugh started right now, you said, when we talked about leadership, and he said, don't expect government to lead or anyone else to lead. I go back to that word leadership, but leadership within one's own. And during the recent election, which we had last week, we all had election experiences. But what really disturbed me was talking to some young children. I'm talking to 6- and 7-year-olds. Because my wife and I are blessed with little grandchildren. And talking to some of their friends who are aged 6 and 7 and 8. And some of the hardline viewpoints which they had inherited from their parents. I thought, oh my God, that's not leadership, that was terrible. So leadership doesn't necessarily need to be leadership from the Prime Minister downwards. Leadership within our own homes about respect and if I can take it further, then kindness. So I know it's been a bit of a ramble, but those are my thoughts.
Quick round of reply. I think you're underselling yourself here. I mean, just back to the point I made, I'm kind of elaborated, but kindness is not about how we feel. Kindness, if you're being truly human, kindness is just like breathing. It's not heroic. You don't have to take a great leap if you're a kind person because you're a human. All you have to do is unleash it.
So let's take a question from the audience. We have this gentleman there, and noted that if you do have a question, please raise your hand and keep it up until Donna here finds you. Thank you.
Vic, off the back of personal ratings, Daniel and Multicultural New South Wales, and we're reporting on issues like this, especially this challenge of the rise of extremist views in our community. And I'm wondering, off the back of your very sobering kind of description of what's been going on globally, if there's any truth in the claim that censorship is the reason, or part of the reason why there has been this kind of resistance movement in the anti-vax movement here in this country, for example, in the Capitol riots that happened in America, even in certain political parties, like the One Nation Party, for example, saying it how it is and giving a voice to kind of these underrepresented people. Is this feeling of censorship that people are not having their say, and the hatred, for example, that Donald Trump was removed from Twitter, does that have anything to do with the growth, the upswing in extremist voices?
In my former life, when I was editor, when I was editor of the Australian Jewish News, I used to have pinned on the notice board behind my desk a quote from the late Justice Lionel Murphy, thank you, Justice Lionel Murphy, in which he said, "Free speech is what is left over after you allow for," and there were 11 categories. There was libel, there was sedition, there was blasphemy, there was treason, there was... In other words, there is no such thing as free speech in our society anyway. And I really hold to that. I do not believe there should be free speech. Free speech comes with responsibilities. Democracy comes with responsibilities. Not only do we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And so some people, sure, might say they feel hemmed in or because their freedoms are trammeled by this and this law, and therefore they are reacting in this particular way, whether it's January 6th, capital rights, or whatever it is. But free speech comes with responsibilities. And so you cannot, and this goes to what I mentioned in my remarks, in which I'll be unpacking in a panel discussion this afternoon, about a campaign which I alleged to bring about a law. And that, the reason for why I felt we needed the law, but I brought together a coalition of 34 communities from A through Z, A starting with Armenian, running Armenian, Baha'i, Chinese, all the way down to Z. I was born in Zimbabwe, there was the Z. So that one worked. And we have a guest here in the audience from Zimbabwe. You were born in Zimbabwe. Take over. And the point is that there was a coalition which came together, feeling very strongly that there needs to be law which says you cannot incite violence on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual preference. And so, now does that inhibit the freedoms of some people? Absolutely it does. I believe it needs to for society to work, for people to respect the rights of others. And so, do some people feel hemmed in by that? I get it and I hear that, but I say deal with it. We need to get on with each other civilly, we need to respect each other's rights, and that means you cannot do whatever it is you want, you cannot threaten whoever you want, and you cannot impinge on the freedoms of whoever you want.
I want to just ask a question from one of our online viewers. And they're asking, how could institutions across government, civil society, private sector, etc., tangibly redefine conceptions of power, influence, strength and success in a way that would align with our collective progress and a deeply diverse society. So,
that's an interesting one. I think with that, it's obviously very hard for our current institutions to reframe themselves, recast themselves quickly, because they're part of a whole system which may be used to operating in another way. And I think we see the bipartisan system, which in many ways was a strength of our societies in the past, doesn't necessarily serve us well anymore. We see the idea of opposing sides, and those are your options, black or white. The legal system, many other institutions function in a way that there's a right and there's a wrong, there's a black and a white. And we know that that's not a very sophisticated way to see the world. And that collaboration, cooperation, consultation are the means to far better options for society. So when we see institutions that are open to other ways, I think that's when we start to see possibilities for change. I've worked in the public sector in the past, and I think most people that have know when consultation is happening genuinely and when it's going through the loop of consultation to tick a box. And when it's genuine, that's when I think the possibility of change starts to happen. And so, the openness of institutions to hear from settings like this and this process, the fact that the whole process of seeking to have the input that came from the initial year of roundtables, but that was genuine consultation, hearing the voices of people, could be anybody. So I think when we take some of those things and try to learn to apply them, but it will take a long time to change a system which has been spent, 1 or 2 centuries at least working through conflict and contest. But again, crises bring change. We've seen for Australia quite significant change at the moment, and who knows where that will go. But unless there's a conscious desire to learn new methods, I think we fall back into the other. If I may, in regard to Vic's point and the question that was asked, I do wonder with some of these very strident voices whether it's also a reflection of people not feeling unhappy with the way the world is, not knowing how to express that and not knowing how to contribute to something different, and so almost being hijacked by these very negative ways of thinking and voicing one's feelings because they don't know of an alternative at this point. They don't know another way to be contributing. And so, I really don't know, it's a question whether some of what we're seeing is just people feeling unhappy with the way the world is and not knowing how to contribute to something different.
Thank you. Well, that is a question for all of us, and hopefully we can explore that today in our small groups. We can take one more question, but do keep your questions in your minds. We do have other panelists, and it's all very relevant. I'm here. Yes, so we can take your question. Thank you.
The reality is, for the leadership is questionable in some countries, like the governments of China versus the Uyghurs, and the Thailand and Vietnam versus the Hmong, Afghanistan versus the Hazaras. People in these communities want to speak out and talk about their plight, but they are persecuted when they speak out. And the leaders themselves and the governments manipulate social media in such an extent that Russia, for example, who's monopolized the social media there and spreading false news. How do you reconcile good leadership or questionable leadership with getting to where we are now when there's so much questionable leadership anyway.
I think we become vulnerable to questionable leadership, I think was your phrase. We become vulnerable to wrong-headed leadership that is not devoted to the building of social harmony and so on, when we are echo what Tessa just said, when we are feeling a bit lost, a bit confused, a bit bewildered because of the erosion of social cohesion. In other words, when society starts to break down, that's a dramatic, sounds like an overstatement, but that is what's happened in Western societies, in particular ours. It's a breakdown because we have lost our sense of community, our sense of connectedness, our need to cooperate and so on. So when that happens, and people feel more alone and celebrate their aloneness, celebrate their individualism. I mean, this is an era of rampant individualism. That's when, losing our sense of solidarity, we become vulnerable to messages that can be deeply misleading, coming from leaders or from social media. I mean, the social media phenomenon still needs a lot more study, and I'm not opposed to social media, but there is a phenomenon which I think we now understand, neuroscience are helping us, the scientists are helping us to understand, which we could call social hunger. We humans need each other. We need eye contact. We need to be with each other face to face for a big chunk of every day. If we don't eat and we get hungry, we get cranky and irrational. Hangry is the word that we don't use. It's exactly the same with our emotional hunger, our need of each other. When we become more fragmented and when we rely more and more on non-personal mediated communication, whether by mass media or social media, we develop social hunger. And that creates, one reason why there's so much anger, bullying, abuse on social media is that a lot of the heaviest users of social media are hangry. Their social hunger is not being satisfied, and they don't even know why they're angry. And that leads to some wildly irrational material being exchanged and some very damaging material, but goes back to the earlier point I made, that we are all more vulnerable to misinformation, bad leadership, social media, all these things, when we are not anchored in a social context, when we are not part of a functioning neighbourhood, group, community of some kind which is mutually supportive. The greatest corrective against misinformation, against dodgy leadership, against abuse in social media, etc., is the comfort, the sense of belonging we get when we are socially connected. I mean, social cohesion is not just a lovely name for a conference. It's what allows humans to function as humans. The other just little footnote on that, institutions, which we've talked a little bit about this morning, governments obviously play a role in developing modifying institutions are like society scaffold. They're only there to prop us up so we can get on with our lives. Life does not happen in institutions. Institutions protect us so we can get on with our lives. And they don't serve us when they do anything other than that. That's why we get angry with institutions, whether they're churches or banks or governments, when we think they're serving themselves rather than just creating the scaffolding that allows us to get on with building social harmony.
Vic, did you have anything to add?
I agree with you.
Friends, thank you, and thank you for indulging us with more time. It is now our break time, and please thank our speakers that have left us with so much to contemplate, tested our assumptions, many questions still that we have that we want to ask, and we could talk, you know, for at least another half an hour or more. But thank you again for your time and for your presentations.